I'm one of the co-producers. Wonderful team that I'll introduce a little bit later. Let's get to it. President Obama said, when so much of our politics is trying to manage this clash of cultures brought about by globalization and technology and migration, the role of stories to unify as opposed to divide, to engage rather than to marginalize, is more important than ever. He said, storytelling brings people together to have the courage to take action on behalf of their lives. We're going to have 3 stories to begin with. We're going to have a short intermission, and we'll have 3 more stories. We will also follow, this is a social experiment for us. By the way, this is the 13th time we've produced storytelling here at First Parish Church. And so we will have this in the social experiment, a Q&A later. So if you have a question about a point that a speaker is making, hold your question, because we're all going to come back up on stage afterwards for a very brief Q&A. Some of the stories are pretty provocative, so you may very well end up with a question you might like to satisfy. Our first storyteller is Bob Niffen. Bob's a history teacher and learning coach at Lawrence Academy right next door. The title of his story, Civilian in My Head.
Good evening. This story takes us back to May of 1971. The setting is Washington, D.C. I'm hoping some of you may remember the May Day anti-war demonstration. It was the largest anti-war demonstration to date. Thousands of protesters came from all across America with the intent of shutting down Washington, D.C. At that time, I was cooling my heels at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was a lieutenant with 6 weeks left in my military career. I was already in graduate school. I was already growing my hair. And indeed, as Carol introduced, I was a civilian in my head. I had no recollection that thousands of protesters were gathering in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, decisions were being made about how to control the demonstration. And the decision was to try to have it controlled by the state and local police and to keep federal troops away from the demonstration. The reason for that, some of you may remember, it was only a year from Kent State. However, the decision was made to send a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division under cover of darkness to Washington and have them sequestered or hidden in RFK Stadium in the event the demonstrations got out of control. So, a young lieutenant on the staff of a colonel was suddenly, along with 2,000 other federal troops, on an airplane in the middle of the night from Fort Bragg, North Carolina to Andrews Air Force Base, where we were bused to RFK Stadium, and the press and the civilian population had no idea that during that 3 days of protest that there were 2,000 federal troops in RFK Stadium. My job as a young lieutenant staff officer was to be a liaison between those troops and the DC police. So in uniform, camouflage uniform, I got to ride around with the Washington, D.C. and state police to all of the hot spots, the Key Bridge, DuPont Circle, the White House, the Capitol, and some other names I can't remember, wherever the protesters were gathered. I was the only federal troop that was visible to the protest, and therein lies a tale. I was often mocked. I was called a baby killer. There was also a lot of humor. I remember a group of female protesters. I assume they were stoned. There was copious marijuana smells in the air. I'd read about marijuana. I didn't. They would look at me and go, "Oh, look, a tree." They would try to get me to smile. I felt like one of those beefeater guards at Buckingham Palace. They'd try to get you to laugh, and of course, because I was surrounded by DC police, I had to put on my professional air, remembering that in my head I was a civilian. So for 3 days, I was the lonely lieutenant, traveling to all the hot spots, communicating back to my colonel with these confrontations, some humorous, some annoying, but in every case, I was looking out at my contemporaries. In fact, people who in 6 weeks might have been my fellow students when I got to graduate school. The brigade of the 82nd Airborne was never called out. The protests basically dried up after 3-4 days, I don't remember. And we all shipped back to Fort Bragg. 6 months later, I was in graduate school. By this point, my hair was on its way. And I remember thinking back at what an extraordinary moment that was, the juxtaposition of a young lieutenant seeing his peers, his colleagues, and trying to still be a professional soldier, but understand the other side. 3.5 million men and women went over into that war, and 68,000 didn't come back. But for that moment, I was the lonely lieutenant juxtaposed against thousands of my peers, really, colleagues. And it was an extraordinary moment of humor, of irony, of sadness that I just will never forget. And I feel blessed that I had the opportunity to be there. And that's my story.
Thank you, Bob. Our next storyteller is Cleo Fisher. Cleo is a master gardener and a member of Groton Grange number 7 here in Groton. I said Groton Grange. a master gardener, and a writer. The title of her story is Ice.
Hello. I grew up on the shore of Lake Huron. And here's Lake Michigan, and here's Lake Huron, and here's the Mackinac Bridge. And so I grew up here. And these lakes they were so there. And the wind was always there. And the water in the Great Lakes sloshes back and forth, and sprays come up all the time. And in the wintertime, it freezes. And some of the ice freezes flat, like the ice on Moran Bay. And they would put a fish shanty city out there, and they'd land airplanes on it, and they would haul supplies over to Mackinac Island with these sleighs, and the ice would sometimes be 4 feet thick. And you could go in a fish shanty and look down those holes, and you could see all that blue-greenness, and then they'd have to chop through, and some people used a drop line, and some people used spears, and the ice was just a magnificent thing, and it was so there in the wintertime that we didn't think anything of it. It was like sidewalks are in cities. Well, sometimes when the wind blows, the water is sloshing in all directions. We call that chop. And the wind would pick the water up, and it would freeze. And it would freeze and fall and freeze and fall and swoop over things, and it would make the most amazing ice caves on the ice. Mounds of ice and pyramids of ice, wonderful pieces of ice. It was like sculpture. Well, one time my mother, she must have been in high school, went out on the ice with her class, and one of the foolish young women decided that she would go inside one of these ice caves that was a mound with a hole in the top. And she couldn't get out. And if the guys hadn't all crawled up there and reached down and hauled her out, well, perhaps she'd be there to this day. And everybody seems to have an ice story. My personal ice story is that I was walking home with my friend Jackie, and our school was on the shore of Lake Huron, and her house was on the shore of Lake Huron, a mile down the way. And so when the ice was frozen, we would walk along there because it was safer than walking on the road with all that traffic, and it was not as difficult as walking along the shingle because that would be all, choppy and so forth. So we'd walk on the nice flat surface of the ice. So one day we're walking along, and there's this expanse of white. No footprint, nothing, just unbroken. And we're walking along, and all of a sudden, I walk off the edge of the ice. And because I am a northern child, I know exactly what to do. I turn myself 180 degrees and slap my hands down on that ice. And now I can feel my boots and snow pants filling up with water. And Jackie, who always giggles when she's nervous, did what all good northern children do. She went flat so fast. And she started crab crawling across that ice, giggling like mad. And she reached out and grabbed my hand, grabbed the other one, and then she started inching back, and I kept heaving myself up a little. That ice was this thick, I could not possibly have gotten out. And finally, here I am, dripping wet and freezing cold, and we dashed back down to her mother's house, and they put me in a hot tub, and I'm alive to tell the tale. Well, some years later, my sister Louise and two of her friends and our dog, Andante, decided they would walk. Well, I don't think the dog decided, but he went along for the ride anyway. They were going to walk to Mackinac Island out there 4 miles out. It was frozen, and it had been frozen. So when they left, they were about, 300 feet from shore, she said. And there was a little gap in the ice like this. And so they just stepped over and went on. But when they got, several hundred feet from Mackinac Island, it was all rubble ice, all chunks of ice broken up. And it was impossible to continue, so they turned around and headed back. Well, it's a long way, and they were walking for a long time. I'm imagining that they were pretty tired. Well, as they were walking, Louise said they got about, I don't know, halfway across, and she heard a note that she said she'd never heard before. It was the deepest note she'd ever heard, as if someone had a giant piano and would plunk their finger down on the lowest note. It was a thrum, thrum sound. Well, they were sufficiently agitated that they took off running as fast as they could. And when they got to the place that was only this wide, now it was this wide. And they ran and leapt over it, but the Andante, he's just back and forth and back and forth. He was just terrified. But finally, they cajoled him sufficiently, and he ran and jumped over, and they grabbed him and ran to shore. And the next morning, my sister looked out to see the ice that had frightened them all so badly, and saw empty water. Every bit of that ice had broken up in the night and floated away. Thank you.
Every time I hear her tell that story, I want to shout, "What the heck were you thinking?" Thank you very much, Cleo. And that's with the onset of an asthma attack. The woman is recovering from bronchitis this week. So I think those are the last words we're going to hear from Cleo tonight. Thank you very much, Cleo. So our next storyteller is Hannah Tellier. And a little factoid about Hannah is that she used to do trapeze and has a video if you want to see it. The title of her story is Wonderland.
All right, let me ask you a question before I start. Well, a couple questions. Have you ever heard of morphine? Codeine, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone? What about Dilaudid? Percocet? Things like that? How about heroin? Yeah, that's the one that everyone's heard of. That is the answer to so many questions. What did you take? What's in that bag? What is that? What did you snort? Heroin. It comes in so many forms. So many people talk about the opiate epidemic, but what is it? What does it mean? What's really happening? And what are we doing to stop it? Tuesday night, or technically Wednesday morning, it's midnight. The tones go off. They ring through the station. My partner and I are jerked awake. We hear the scratchy voice of the dispatcher come over the radio. "Attention, Revere Fire Department. Engine 1 in the ambulance, respond to the Wonderland MBTA station for the man down." That's Engine 1 and the ambulance, respond to the Wonderland MBTA station for a man down. Man down could be anything. It could be a sleeping homeless man. It could be a guy that fell on the tracks. It could be somebody got hit by a car. It could literally be anything. I sit up on the couch after my 20 minutes of sleep. Look at my partner from across the room, and he's sitting there like this. I feel the same exact way. We get up and kind of force ourselves out of our, well, not out, but off of our couches. I pull on the boots that I've already been wearing for 20 hours, and I glance at my scrawny little body in the window reflection, wondering why the hell I chose a job where I regularly lift people more than twice my weight. We walk out to the garage, and we get in the truck. My partner gets in the driver's seat, and I open the bay doors. Jump in the passenger seat, we flip on the lights, and we fly down the streets of Revere. When we get on scene at Wonderland, the fire engine's there, a couple cop cars. The radio is pretty quiet, so usually that means that it's nothing big. It's probably just a drunk guy. But we show up. I walk up to a crowd of firefighters and cops, and one of the firefighters comes up to me and says, we found him on the ground, so we started CPR, and we found this needle next to him, so we gave him Narcan. It's pretty simple. I look down, and there's a guy, maybe like 40, not breathing, on the ground, just there, in the middle of the train station. So, cops are doing CPR. Firefighter had given, amazingly, 1 dose of Narcan. Usually they give 6 in a span of like 5 minutes. Then the person wakes up trying to kill you. But I looked down at him. Just this guy. He's, and also all his, like, he's just dead. Overdosed. On the ground. My partner throws the first in bag on the ground, pulls out a dose of Narcan, shoves the thing up the guy's nose, and pushes the plunger. Do you know what bagging is? If you bag a person, you have this little bag filled with air, and you squeeze it, and it pumps air into their lungs so they can breathe. We're sitting there for what literally feels like an eternity, bagging this dude, trying to get him to breathe again, trying to get him to wake up. All of a sudden, he's just lying there like this. All of a sudden, he opens his eyes. He opens his eyes, and he looks at me. He just looks at me, takes a big, gasping breath, and looks at me. I looked at him and I said, "Hey, what'd you take?" He just goes, sits up, vomits, and looks at me. We're just here to help you. You're not in trouble. Let's just take a ride to the hospital. You can get in our truck. Everything's going to be fine. He just looks at me. Then, all of a sudden, just like that, he gets up and he's running. Literally, no joke, running. The cops chased him for about 100 feet and then gave up. Because, you know, our job really isn't about running. We said goodnight to the firefighters and the cops. I went and wrote my report, and we left. You know, I try so hard. I try so hard to help these people, and I try to want to help these people. But when things like this, and I know it sounds funny, but when things like this happen multiple times a day, sometimes multiple times a week, it's so hard. Some people don't want the help yet, and I can't force it on them. We see some people twice a day. We see some people 4 times a day. The hospitals are burned out. It's hard. So many people ask me, don't you try and help them? Don't you chase them? Don't you care? Of course I care. I do this job because I care. I don't know if what I'm doing is helping. And I don't know if there is anything more that I can do. But I do know that I'm trying. And what I'm doing, all I'm doing is trying. I am trying to help people. And to the people who ask me those questions, why don't you ask yourself, what can you do to help? What are you doing to help? Our country is broken. It's falling apart at the seams. We're failing ourselves, and we're failing each other. And I know that it's hard to think about things like that, but there's something that we can do, and there's something that can be done to fix this. I just don't know what it is. You know, Wonderland may be the end of the line in Revere, but addiction, overdoses, it doesn't have to be the end of the line for anybody. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. The next three stories are going to lead up to our featured storyteller, Rose Saya. You'll want to be sure to stick around for that. So I wanted to mention the art on the stage is with thanks to artist Karen Provost. And you're welcome to come on up and take a look closer. This is multimedia collage. There's story under story, and you have to get up close sometimes to read the detail. Let's see. The church itself, First Parish Church of Groton, Unitarian Universalist, is. I've been a member here 17 years, and I just love this community. We're a community who holds the dignity of the individual as tantamount to everything. It's a non-denominational church, and if we covenant to take care of one another and to take care of people outside of our church as well. We're very devoted to social justice issues, and if you would care to try us on for size, the service is tomorrow morning, and our wonderful minister, Aaliyah Kemmler, will be discussing the covenant that we all commit to as Unitarian Universalists tomorrow morning. And our youth choir is going to sing, what's the song the youth choir is going to sing, you guys? Yeah. Alleluia. So, by Leonard Cohen, the youth choir is going to sing that. So, without further ado, let me introduce our next storyteller, Eric Elbott, who walks through life without being harmed. The name of his story is Three Snakes.
Eric, one of your people is walking through the snake-filled river, and she's bleeding. The old villager came over to me. She doesn't have your good snake karma. For months I had walked through India, many adventures, but I'd come to this remote village to find quiet, to do a little introspection, and to lick my wounds. I went down to the riverside, and the she was a 14-year-old French girl who, when she was fording the river, had broke water, and the bleeding was not from the snake bite. She was starting her birth. The villagers came up to me when they saw the situation, and they said, "We cannot get involved in this. If a mother or baby dies, the whole village is in trouble. She's your people, you take care of her." I said, "Focus, Eric, focus." And I asked for one of the huts and a bed, and they gave me the floor of a porch and a straw mat. After 13 hours of breathing and pushing and screaming, her cervix had swollen so close that the head could not come out, and it looked like the situation was getting very dangerous. At the same time, the villagers came up to me and said, "No more screaming. Our animals are getting nervous. Indian women don't scream in birth." Focus, Eric, focus. I asked one of the women, if she could heat up coconut oil to body temperature. I poured the coconut oil into the French girl, and almost like a football popping out, the baby just popped out. It was a deep moment of joy for me. I tied off the umbilical cord, and now that everyone was okay, the villagers gave her one of the huts and one of the beds. And I put out word to French people in southern India that one of theirs needed their help, and many came, which allowed me to get ready to go into an even more remote place to do what I felt I needed to do. I was hiking up a stream to the high jungle, and the villager before I left told me, "The jungle is safe now, but when the snakes have babies, it's very dangerous." I promptly ignored that and walked up the stream, found an open space, and began my retreat. Days of meditation and chanting turned into weeks. And monkeys, young monkeys from everywhere, had gathered in a big circle around me, mainly to ridicule me and laugh at me. But then one day, the big male monkeys came, and they have thumbs, and they picked up sticks and started hitting the ground with their sticks. And I knew that I was not safe there to sleep in the open for another night. I picked up my pack and went over to the trail by the stream. But the snakes were hanging from the branches, hissing in my face. The babies had come, and the mothers were fiercely protective. I was trapped between the monkeys and the snakes. What do I do? Focus, Eric, focus. I walked over to the cliff side and looked down. It was a very rocky, crumbly kind of side, but I felt that that was my only option. And so as it was getting dark, my life hung between my fingertips and my toes as I moved very, very slowly down to the bottom of that cliff. Somehow I made it, and I was very grateful. I decided I wasn't finished with working on myself, so I found another mountain that was higher. There was no jungle and no monkeys, and I felt, whoa, here's my spot. And there was a beautiful point where there was a ledge looking over the edge, and there was a red sunset unfolding. And I threw my pack into a little cave and went and dangled my feet over the edge and breathed easy. Finally, I can relax. But out of that little cave came a huge snake, longer than I was tall and bigger around than my legs. The king cobra came out and at arm's length from me, reared up and also watched the sunset. And I was sitting there looking out of the side of my eyes saying, "Eric, this is the day you die." Focus. Focus really well. And I decided that when the king cobra was ready to strike me, I was better off rolling off the ledge and rolling down the cliff. But then, when the sun went down, so did the king cobra and went back into the cave. I looked up at that red sunset and I said, "Guy in the sky, thank you." And I left my backpack in the cave and climbed down. When I got down, I said, "It's time for me to go home while I'm still alive." The flight from Bombay to Boston was delayed. To kill time, I went to a museum, and somehow in my wandering, I ended up in a room full of stuffed snakes. And uncontrollably, my body just started shaking. very hard, very scary, and there was nothing I could do. And the guards had gathered to talk about whether to get an ambulance for me. And I told them, wait, wait. I just signaled them. And finally, after about almost an hour, my body stopped shaking. And I breathed easily, and my mind felt clearer than my mind had ever felt. It felt piercingly clear, almost like I was a newborn baby. To celebrate that, I went to a barber and had my long hair shaved off and my beard shaved off. And I really looked like a bald baby then. I looked like the French girl's baby. And over the years, to hold on a little bit of that moment of enlightenment for me, I've maintained that little bald head. Thank you, snakes. Thank you, monkeys. Thank you, French girl, for my birth and death and rebirth. And thank you for sharing it with me one more time.
Thank you so much, Eric. Eric's got a ton of stories. That's the first, I'm sure, of many, I hope. So our next speaker is also Eric, our next storyteller, Eric Fisher, with his story, Wolf in Sheep's Clothing.
Good evening. I'm wondering, I'd like to ask a question first, which is how many people in this audience actually remember the day Kennedy was shot? Oh my goodness, quite a few. All right. And it's funny, just a little sidelight. I was talking to a guy about 30 years old yesterday, and I said, I bet you don't remember the day Kennedy was shot. He said, of course I do. I saw it on YouTube. All right. Well, I guess there are different levels of experience. But 1963 was a weird year. I want to take you back to that time and try to see if I can evoke a little bit of the turmoil, the boiling anger in the South about the whole integration, segregation thing. Remember, in the summer of 1963 was when Martin Luther King marched from Selma to Montgomery. And for just a little context, I understood perhaps better than a lot of people who actually lived in the North, because my mother was born 50 miles south of Selma in a little country town, and we spent a month out of every year in that town. So I really kind of got exposed. At that point, before 1963, before 1961, my father, who was a Unitarian minister, whose name's on the wall up here, this was his first parish, he was a minister and very successful of the West Newton Church. And so in 1961, he accepted a call to go to St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, people don't think terribly much of St. Petersburg being in the South because there are so many Northerners there, but let me tell you, in 1963, 1964, St. Petersburg, well, for one thing, there were billboards that were put up by the John Birch Society saying, "Impeach Earl Warren." Earl Warren was, if you remember, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time that the Brown versus Board of Education decision was handed down, which said segregation is unconstitutional. A lot of people in the South were absolutely outraged. They were furious. And then Kennedy is shot. And then we have Lyndon Johnson and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Did I say it was boiling? Well, in 1964, it was boiling even more. And remember the National Guard, escorting black children to the schoolhouse door? Well, my dad was a guy you would never, ever believe, from looking at him, from looking at the way he managed his parish or anything else, that he was one of the most absolute radical social activists that ever happened. And he believed in working within the system. So, for instance, one of the things he did in St. Petersburg was work with a black minister to select and train and groom a bunch of black people to take the civil service exam, so that when the next job opening happened in the St. Petersburg post office, the top 3 scorers on that civil service exam were all black. Now, you may be familiar, civil service rules say you have to take one of the top 3. So, by doing this backdoor thing, Dad integrated the St. Petersburg post office. Needless to say, there were people who were not happy with this. Carol was going to give a trigger warning, but she didn't. Maybe she forgot. Anyway, I have to tell you that the next part of this story is extremely politically incorrect, and some people may find it a little offensive. I can only justify it by saying it really happened. I was the person who experienced it, and so it's real. So he'd done that kind of stuff, and so he had a reputation in town. This guy is a guy who can actually work the system to get blacks in where they're not supposed to be. So one day I'm home after school. I was in high school, and I came home, started doing my homework, started doing my piano practice, and the phone rings. And I walk to the phone. I pick up the phone, and I say, hello. My voice had changed. I sound a lot like my father on the telephone. And I hear this voice, and it says, nigga labadeh. I said, what? He said, it's nigga labadeh. And I said, yes, what? And then, long pause, and then, we'll be out to see him, Mr. Fisher. We don't like nigger lovers here. And so it was only then that I realized that what that guy was asking me, I was a little language challenged being from the North. So he was saying, is the nigger lover there? Well, I didn't realize how serious this was, that the guy probably meant business, even though, there'd been bombings in Birmingham and Unitarian minister had been killed in the march from Selma to Montgomery the summer before. I was half amused. I kind of thought it was a joke. I told my dad about it, and he took it very seriously. Called his friend the mayor, and it turned out that we had police patrols by our house for the next 2 weeks. Fortunately, that's as far as it went. But after all these years, I can still remember. It's almost as if it was yesterday. I remember walking to that phone, picking it up, listening to that voice. It was absolutely one of the traumatic events of my life, and it caused me to see the world through different eyes. Thank you.